get the recording. Okay, good.
All right. We have a quorum. I will call the meeting to order. Shall we do roll call first?
Sure. Tammy Bem. Nick, she is, oh, thank you. Nicole Chaput,
Here.
Joseph Duggan,
Here.
John Eppers,
Here.
Jennifer Finney, Matthew Heil, Gene Kirkton, Kyle Klemp here, and Michael Yockley.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, next up is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we take a motion?
I'll motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second. I second.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? No, minutes are approved. Next, we have the opportunity for public comment. Is there anyone here from the public who cares to make a comment?
None
Okay,
online either.
looks like not. Next item is governance. We don't have any action items on the agenda. Is there anything else that needs to be brought forward, even though it's not on the agenda? All right, we'll move on. Item 6, old business. And we'll start with a follow-up on the review and discussion of other local municipalities' charters.
Madam Chair, if it would be okay with the member group, could we flip A and B?
Sure.
City attorney has other business this evening, so.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
Nice to see you again. I have 3 questions. Actually, I have 2, 3, 4, 5 questions that I'm prepared to answer tonight, just so that I can help you move along. But the first one is the issue of the word morals. What does that mean when we see that in the charter? And it's an anachronism, all right, except that it's designed to show the scope of the powers that are conferred to the city by the grant of a charter. All right. So why do we talk about morals? Well, if you look at our old codes, and if you look at some of our things like our real estate plans, we have language in there that says we will not do things like establish bawdy houses. Great word, right? There are limitations that we have on the sale of alcohol, that sort of thing. The idea is that government ultimately oversees the morals of the community, because who better than local government is going to understand the needs of the community in that regard. So we were given the opportunity to license and regulate those things if we chose to do it. So we always see that word thrown in. It's always there. I mean, things like movie houses, you couldn't show certain kinds of movies. Things like, again, like alcohol. I mean, the city of Webster Groves was dry for many, many years. When I moved in here in 1988, the only liquor license in the city of Webster Groves was Augustus Moody's, which is now CJ Muggs. And so, which is, by the way, up for sale. And so the fact of the matter is that those were within the morals issues of government's right to regulate. Good, bad, or indifferently, it's a reality. Again, a bit of an anachronism. Do we see folks doing that sort of thing now? We don't. But you could find it again in areas like the limitations that we have on when a bar must close. I mean, there were some state rules and regulations, but the city can impose its own rules and regulations in that regard. Why? Well, we want people home at night. Again, is that public safety? Maybe, but it also fell under the category of morals. So, you know, again, if you look at these things historically, those are the sorts of applications that we would see. Is it an important word? It is, because there can be some things that perhaps we haven't thought about that we want to make sure we protect. But I will tell you this, it is also found in state statute. When we talk about the powers of statutory cities, that language is there. So it probably doesn't mean much other than it is a power that is inherent in the grant of authority that you have in the chart. Questions?
Is there another word that is not quite so?
Yeah.
Offensive?
Yeah.
You know, I will grab my thesaurus and see what I can find. But again, it really does have more of a legal meaning than it does anything else. And so again, it's there. It really is concomitant with the concept of public safety. And that's probably the better way to understand it. Now, again, how we interpret that today versus how we would have interpreted it 60 years ago is an entirely different question, but that's probably the best way to look at
If public safety was substituted, would it give it a whole new meaning?
it. It wouldn't necessarily cover everything.
Okay,
Although again, and I'm hesitant because this is my own philosophy, so I'm inserting that here and I want to make sure that you're aware of this is my interpretation based upon a number of opinions that have been set down by the court. But I think you want to read in these grants of power, I think you want to read it broadly. Because what it's saying is that we're given all the rights that the state legislature has in terms of the laws that we make. We just can't make something that's necessarily in conflict with that, right? So if we've got all of those powers, it really needs to be all of those powers. Otherwise, you've created something of a void and you don't want to do that. So, again, I would tell you, I would approach very carefully the idea of eliminating the word or trying to substitute another because it has a legal meaning. Maybe more than anything else. Did that answer your question, Paul? Great. Okay. Seeing none other on that question. The next is the explanation on the referendum requirements and options for consideration. Referendum and initiative always go together, right? So a referendum is a recall of a law that's been passed. Initiative is a request to create a law that has not yet been created. The idea here behind initiative and referendum is found both in the state constitution, it's Article 3, Section 49 of the state constitution, and in state statutes, Chapter 116 of the revised code of the state of Missouri. It has very specific rules for how you do this sort of thing. But the thing that, again, is sort of the unavoidable aspect of this is the right to referendum and recall is essential. It is both a constitutionally guaranteed right and a statutorily guaranteed right. So it's very important. And the reason that it's there is because it provides what is referred to as direct democracy. The idea here is if you all as a group, as a people, as a community, determine that your city council has overstepped its bounds or not gone far enough in things that you think they need to do, this is your way to cure that problem. Okay. Yes, I have elected government, but there is sort of a fallback position here if elected government isn't doing all the things we'd like them to do. Now, you see our state legislature, by the way, which ignores this all the time. But again, the truth of the matter is this is an essential element to everything that every governmental charter, every bit of governmental authority that we will ever find. All right, because I have to have the ability to act if you don't, or to repeal an act if we as a group don't like it. The only place that I think that there is some wiggle room is in the percentages that you require for what is going to ultimately be either a referendum or an initiative. Okay, so currently under Article 14 of our code, we have a provision that tells us how many people we need to have in order to do a recall. And so here, a petition requesting here it says a petition signed by electors of the city equal in number for an initiative of at least 10% of the votes cast in the last regular municipal election, 10%. At the statewide level, if you want to do an initiative or a referendum of something that's done by the state legislature, it's a much smaller number, it's 5%. Unless it's a constitutional amendment, then it's 8%. Okay, so under our charter, for the purposes of an initiative, it is 10% of the number of votes cast in the last municipal election. Okay, so that number that is in there is not necessarily built into any statutory requirement. So you could theoretically talk about changing that number, making it higher, making it lower. Okay. Again, what's a good idea? What's a bad idea? If you look at referendum, by the way, which is that recall issue, that requires it's the same 10%. But recall of elected
25.
That's recall of elected positions, right?
Yes, recall.
That's recall. Referendum.
It's 10.
At
least 10%.
10, yeah, it's still 10. So again, I think you'd have some room if you wanted to adjust the numbers there to make it more difficult, but the courts frown on those things. And the reason they do is because they want things decided in the ballot box in most places. And so the truth of the matter is they're very reluctant to limit the rights of the electorate. That doesn't mean that, again, we couldn't take 10 and make it 15, or we couldn't take 10 and make it 20, okay? But it might be challenged. And if it were challenged, again, the courts are going to construe very strictly and look for very closely the reasons that that city council would have relied upon in making such a recommendation. But those numbers, the 10%, are not written in stone. So I think there is some wiggle room there. But again, there's some great articles online. If you go online and look at the history of initiative and referendum in the state of Missouri, there's a number of scholarly articles. There was one that was written in 1983 that nothing's really changed. And so again, it's very interesting to know what's there. It talks about the philosophy behind initiative and referendum, why we do it, why it's there. There are a number of other articles, and both of the two that I'm thinking of, one was in 1983, the other one is in 99. Both of them were written for law journals at Mizzou. And so I think that, you know, again, they are scholarly articles in terms of conversations about why it is and what it is. I think it gives you a great description. But it's our charter subscribes very closely to the statutory requirements that we find in 116. The Constitution doesn't specify what it means. It just simply says that you have to have a right to do it. And it's pretty simple. It says that people reserve the power to propose and enact or reject laws and amendments to the Constitution by initiative and independent of the General Assembly. And also that applies to those laws that are passed by the State Assembly. So again, it's making sure that people ultimately have the right to decide.
So can you share that what you just read? Thank you.
It's actually in Ballotpedia, but I'll send it to you. It's in Ballotpedia for Missouri, that's specific to Missouri.
Okay, yeah.
But I'll share that with
Thank
you. And I'll send you the articles too. I think frankly, they are a better description, and they're not long, 27 pages, which is probably 25 more than you need, but you can find quickly the section that will talk about why it exists.
Thank you.
The explanation of council's ability to send proposed charter amendments to the voters on separate election dates, and that's a great question. And again, if you look at our own charter as it exists right now, there are several ways that we can amend the charter. And again, you as an advisory board are one way that sends recommendations to council. Council could have done this without you. They could have done their own recommendations and ultimately put it before the voters without you. There is no provision in the charter that limits the way in which it ultimately gets sent to the voters. Nor is there anything in the charter that says it's got to be all in one fell swoop, or you can break it up in its parts. There's no direction whatsoever. So we are left to our discretion. When I say we, I mean the council is left to their discretion as to how they would ultimately present it to the voters. But we've had situations where we have seen multiple parts. So for instance, St. Louis County has had multiple charter amendments on the ballot at any given time. They have elected to put sometimes 4, 5, 6 charter amendments on at any given time. Could it be 12? It could. Is there a point where, you know, again, you might get into a place where you've saturated the potential voter and they're not going to begin to understand what you're doing? Maybe, but again, that's a decision or a recommendation that you all can make and that council can ultimately decide in terms of what they want to do. But there's no limit, there's no guide to how it gets done. And so that means that we can do it any way we want. Okay, so in the absence of clear directions, which would either require or prohibit, it's left to discretion. And discretion, as long as it's not arbitrary or capricious, is going to be on. Again, if you had lots of recommendations for charter changes, and every change other than those things that again might be gender changes and that sort of thing are going to require voter approval. All right. So if you have multiples and you think you're going to dilute what you're attempting to do by sending multiples, you can say, we think that these are the most important. We think these are, you know, secondary importance. And here's how we're recommending you break it down. And then it becomes council's decision as to how it gets done. But there's not a limit or a requirement as to how it gets done. The only thing that you have to keep in mind is that every time we run something on a ballot, it has a cost implication. So if we have nothing else on the ballot and we're running something, we're going to incur a cost, and that's going to be in the tens of thousands of dollars. That's probably going to be close to six figures on a single election, maybe 65, 80, somewhere.
For one question?
Well, for any question.
For any question.
Yeah, that's what I've seen in other places, in other instances. You know, again, it can be done. We can break it up, but that's something, again, it ultimately isn't your call. That's going to be a call that ultimately council's going to make, but you can make recommendations in that regard. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. Slicing through these. Should causes for forfeiture of office beyond interference with the city manager. By the way, it's not just interference with the city manager, but it's interference. Be added to council vacancies, Article 2.6 is there in the model cities charter. So there are inherent causes that would be there. So if you had a conflict of interest, an unresolved or unrequited conflict of interest, that could be a grounds for recall. If you had malfeasance in office, let's say there was corruption. So take what we had in the city, where you had 3 aldermen who were accepting bribes. That is cause for removal. They resigned, but that is cause for removal. Okay, it's not specified in the charter, but it's still grounds for removal. So there are inherent in the elected office position grounds that would allow removal. Again, some of those are statutory, some of them are simply what we call equitable. I don't think you could spell them all out. I think you have to be careful and recognize that this is a constitution which has general powers. Once you start going into some of those details, you're going unnecessarily because they're provided for in other places. And you sort of lose the generality, the broad scope that you want to have as a constitution. So my recommendation would be, even though you could add additional reasons for forfeiture, I don't think you need to, because they are contemplated in other areas. So you can't possibly think of all the reasons why you would want to. So the best you could do would be to say, and this also includes this, but it's not limited to these things. And once you start adding inclusive language like that, you might as well just leave it all out there anyway, because it's, again, provided for in other places. But it'd be a violation of your oath. It would be, and again, some of those things might be equitable as opposed to specific statutory provisions. But I would suggest that it's written broadly enough that those powers are found other places. Does that make sense? Okay. And finally, what would the ramifications of removing departments from the charter and regulating them by ordinance be? In particular, police and fire departments, would there be implications for union contracts? So let me start with the ramifications of removing departments from the charter. So let's go back to the powers of council and the powers of the city manager. City manager is the chief executive officer, and it spells that, it says that specifically in the charter itself. So if you are taking things away from the city manager, you're changing the inherent power that we're giving to the city manager in that regard. So you have to keep that in mind. Ultimately, if you're talking about making departments answerable to council, I'm not aware of anyone that or any place that has a city manager form of government that does that. It's the city manager who is the professional who is running the office, the government itself, from the day-to-day operations, from the administrative approach. That is the job of the chief executive, is to run those things. Okay. Now you will see, if you look at the county charter, you will see a situation where we create in the charter itself some things like a provision that deals with police and a provision that deals with fire. But again, the difference there is that they are ultimately all responsible to the council. Here, we have a city manager form of government. So it is in conflict with that form of government to say, I'm going to take parts of it, separate it out, and have them answerable someplace else. That would suggest then that the city manager is no longer the chief executive officer of the city.
I think you misunderstand our question.
Okay, maybe I do.
It really was, in the model charter, they said not to put those groups in the charter, to do them by law. So it's not to change whether it is managed by the city manager, which is reasonable.
Right.
It is simply to take it out and move it into statute.
So if you look at what they've done in the charter, it's again written broadly. Okay, you can still by statute regulate, and I don't have any problem with that. But again, if you take it out of the charter itself, I think it changes the fundamental nature of what the city manager does, because now, if it's only by ordinance,
Mhm.
now they're answerable, even if in the ordinance, as you say, they're answerable to the city manager. It's an ordinance that's generated by council.
But that's true of all departments.
No,
No,
no.
we don't have.
All departments are in the chart.
But I wanted to add to Matthew's comments, my concern at least, and I think it's others, is you don't have, for instance, the agencies of the federal government named in the US Constitution.
Right.
Might be obsolete, the way, what if the city manager wants to combine departments or add a new department or do a lot of other creative things? You're limited, you have to go to the voters to get that done.
So the city manager has the power to create new departments.
Yeah, but why should any departments be named in the charter?
Again, from my perspective, I'm only guessing as to why they did this
Yeah.
when they wrote it initially. But my guess is, and again, this wasn't necessarily what I was saying, it was sort of answering what you were suggesting, Matthew, in terms of how I think it is necessary in order to be consistent with the grant of power in the charter itself. But coming back to what you've said, you name departments in here because what you want to do is you want to address the scope of what it is, in my opinion, what it is that the city manager has to ultimately address. And again, you're sort of building the house from the top down, but you are building the house, and you're going to talk about all the things that are there that are going to be present. What you're trying to do is think of all the things that you can think about. You could create a new department, and it would make sense in this day and age, right? It would be one for just IT. I mean, IT wasn't something we would have contemplated.
Well, why do you need to put that in the charter?
You don't, but you need to give the power to the city manager. to do
Right.
it. So
So
if you-
nobody's questioning, no one wants to change the power the city manager has.
But if you do it for those departments, then take all departments out in order to be consistent.
Yeah, I think they should all be out, right? Yeah,
And
and
again,
that's what by the way, that's what the model charter says.
again, as long as it's clear that the chief executive officer is still your city manager,
Yes.
who will make decisions as to departments, you can do that.
Yeah, nobody has a quarrel with that. It's naming departments. And there were, last time we went through, there's certain procedures they called for that have become obsolete. It didn't envision computerized record keeping and so on.
Right. It didn't-
And, but it says in there, you gotta have paper invoices and this and that. And I think it limits the power of the manager to say which departments you have to have.
You can go back and you can do it another way. Part of what I think they were trying to do. go ahead. Three point three. Yes. Yeah, so again, could you just leave 3.3 in here and take all the departments out? You could. Here's the only problem is, so let's talk about the Department of Finance. Part of the reason that the Department of Finance is identified in here is because we wanted to talk about specific duties that we expected finance to do. And again, when the charter was created, there were things that they wanted to make sure were being done. And so going back to your question, why did they put these things in here? I think at that point, again, they were attempting to make sure that everybody understood what was going to be done and how these departments were going to break down. Could you rethink that? You could. Again, I think it is important to have some structure somewhere along the way so that people can understand where those lines are. But again, that could be defined by the city manager and it could be defined by ordinance.
If I might, in doing a little research ad hoc on this, it seems that several municipalities in St. Louis County have moved away from naming specific departments. And they have some transition language here that say, we don't name them, but, we don't change what's already in place. And that council ordinances can then make changes further down the road. I think what we're trying to understand is what are the implications of that? If we were to explore that, I'm neither for or against it at this point. I'm just trying to understand what what the triggers are and domino effect is.
So there's a couple of immediate implications, and I would say one of which is the transparency question. Okay, so first and foremost, again, if you have a structure somewhere that people can look at in a relatively short. And so I would tell you that, you know, again, the 52 pages that we have of our charter itself are relatively short. It tells us that we've got a chief executive officer, and the chief executive officer oversees certain departments. Okay, so I can look at it and I can figure out what everybody's supposed to do in theory. That doesn't limit, it still gives the opportunity to create other departments, and there's a procedure for doing that. All right. So again, could you limit it? Yes, you'd want to make sure it's internally consistent. So that if you were going to say, we are going to eliminate these departments, but these job duties will still exist and put them in the code, they would still be there. But if you tried to look at our code or any municipal code, they're hard to read. They are really, and as a lawyer, it's hard to read. And again, we've gone online and we've done all sorts of things to try and make them more understandable, but they're infinitely more difficult than the charter to read. So if I were trying to figure out who has responsibility for what, and I was going to look in the code to see what ordinances have been passed, you know, you can do a word search and we've made them searchable, but it pulls up. And unfortunately, everybody sort of uses the same software to search these things. It pulls up every place that it mentions the word that you've talked about. So it's not an easy way to navigate what we're going to look at. So that's one implication. In terms of the other implications about union contracts, it wouldn't. You would still have a collective bargaining unit that would still sign a contract with the city manager that ultimately gets approved by council before it gets done. Nothing would change in that. So you could operate by going through and changing all the departments or taking out all of those names and say in there, in the past, you know, this is what we've done. We leave that up to the city manager to establish departments as he or she sees fit to do so with approval of council. And as long as there's oversight that's being provided by the council, I think you'd probably be safe.
Okay, thank you.
Did I answer what you were going to say? So again, coming back to it, you can make those changes. There's nothing that's written again in stone that says you have to list all these departments in there. I think it was done at least initially so that people understood what the structure was. And again, it's 60 years old.
Say in the 1950s, people expected things to last a long time. We don't believe that anymore. We need to be much more
As
flexible.
someone who was born in the 1950s,
Me
I'm
too.
laughing.
Yeah, no, we're.
No, I get it. And again, there was not the same trust in people understanding, right? I mean, the ability to go online and to get the information that we can get now simply didn't exist then. If you wanted to read the charter then, you had to come up and get it.
One of the copies in the library.
Yeah, that's right. Or go to the library. You'd have to come up and get the code and they would put it on the desk and it was a huge document. And again, working your way through it was almost an impossibility. So we've changed all of those things now. And again, if I were going to add a department anywhere, I'd add an IT department, right? We actually kind of do have that. But again, it's a classic example of something we didn't think about in 1954 when this charter was adopted. So you can make those changes. Again, you just have to make sure that it's all internally consistent. So you wouldn't just eliminate police and fire. And that's actually how I was reading the question. Maybe I should have read it. But you again could eliminate all those things, but make sure that you're again coming back to the same structure form where those things would be ultimately reflected in the code.
So what is the process? What would be the process for that? So suppose that they were all eliminated from the charter and we say these things should be in code and we give the city manager, we add a duty that they can create departments as needed with the approval of the council.
So you'd have a much shorter.
Change all of the rules right away, or how does that, what's that?
You'd have a much shorter charter and it'd be a much more readable charter. You would take out of the charter, I think.
But I'm thinking about the process. Do we have to have the laws or do we have to have those rules built first?
Well, I think you would establish the rules because you're not going to change that without the approval of the electorate, right? And so you have to show them what it is you're actually changing. So we'd have to actually it all have to be in place, but you'd be removing Article 5, Article 6, Article 7, Article 8. Arguably, Article 11, at least as to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Building Commissioner. So you'd be eliminating all those sections. But you could again do that, I think, with the existing language that you already have for city manager. I want to look at that and make sure that I firmly believe that at the end of the day, with that in mind. But I think the powers that you've already granted to the city manager in the charter are probably broad enough to include and encompass that.
If I may, if I understand you, Matthew, you're worried that we'll have a void of how to operate some of these departments. And I think you can speak to that much better than I can, but there are a lot of these departments where we have ordinances in place already. We have personnel policies in place. Frankly, I'm not sure for departments, either of us ever go back to the charter and really look and see what's in the charter for these departments.
I don't think it would create a void at all. You just adjust the language. And again, what you'd end up with is a paragraph that would say departments are going to be, organized by the city manager. And you'd always want to build in with the advice and consent of council. Again, just because I think that's always a good idea. Oversight never hurts. Thank you. That's 5. You ready more?
Is that it? Okay, great, thank you.
No, yeah, and I've got a few more minutes. I'll stick around and see where we're going.
All right, do you have a preference whether we tackle A or C while you're still here?
No, ma'am, go ahead.
Okay, why don't we go back up to A then? Discussing the charters of some other local municipalities. Did staff have any comment they wanted to make before we dove in, or?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There wasn't. In the last meeting, I think the consensus was that over the holiday, people didn't dive into the homework, if you will. And so I think it was Ms. Fame, and I may be wrong, that you needed some time to digest, and others as well. So it's just on there to simply have the conversation.
I wasn't here.
Oh, no, when
So
you-
it would be.
When you, I'll say Miss Finney, since she's. But anyhow, just an opportunity for members to have a
Okay,
conversation.
Great, thank you. Did everybody have a chance to look over the 3 charters or have any particular comments you wanted to open with, or we're just kind of keeping it all in the back of our heads this week?
Yeah, I've scanned 2 or 3 of them, but at this point, I don't have any direct questions.
My only comment is, Shrewsbury has a system of both, geographical represents, some people are elected geographically and some are elected citywide. I thought that was I'm not commenting whether that's a good idea or not, but I thought it was interesting, and they also don't have residency requirements to run for office. My favorite beating a dead horse issue.
Everybody has their topic. Yeah, I also took just a quick look at it, and the thing that I thought was the most relevant to the conversation today was it looks like a lot of them kind of stripped out all the detail about what the departments are, that they sort of left that up to ordinance. All right, any other comment on that before we move on? Okay, item 6C. Any questions or comments related to any of the other articles that we've already reviewed? Anything that's popped up as you've gotten deeper into the code that relates to the other information that's been provided to us? All right, take that as a no. Item 7, new business. I'm wondering if it might be a little bit easier if we flip the order on this and got the update from the comp committee. Just so that we don't get excited about all of our other topics and then don't have enough time at the end for, for the comp talk. So Laura, do you wanna, is that update for you?
I don't think that's me. I think you all have a
Okay.
subcommittee on top.
The subcommittee, that's right. So that you, Joe?
John or I are 2 or 3, 4 members of us that are serving on this committee. I'll speak to that. We're planning a meeting on Wednesday evening, kind of dive into this deeper. And hopefully, if at least those who can, of the group, meet in person. We'll talk it through and I, several ideas have been already bounced around, that been shared via email. And we'll kind of talk those through and see, if there's, a consensus yet, so or if there's other ideas to move forward with.
Okay.
John, do you have anything else?
We're gonna have our first meeting on Wednesday and
Yeah.
we all got different ideas and we're gonna sit down at the table and see what we can come up with.
All right, that'd be a good conversation. Look forward to hearing about it. Okay, then let's dive into our main topic for today. Going through the charter, starting with Article 5, Section 13. Which is effective date, certification, and copies. And I wasn't here last week. I don't know kind of the cadence or the flow on how you guys did this. Joe, were you taking people through this on your calendar or was Jeannie doing it?
Jeannie was,
Okay.
So we
Great.
have, so on here, we put in all the comments that
Mhm.
we have
Yeah,
generated.
super
And, that first section, the staff recommended that we get rid of the printed and mimeograph and otherwise reproduced sections. So that's where they ended up, I think.
If I may, if we're discussing and considering removing departments, do we really want to get into the weeds of each of these departments before we decide on that? Because it looks like, as Neil mentioned earlier, these next sections are all, and I know we discussed it last week too, but our last meeting, but again, if we're considering just removing it all, why are we going through each itemized detail? Just a thought.
Just comment for Melissa, I guess my concern would be is, I think we need to understand kind of the implications as we go through the sections, what changes are there. There may be some items within these sections that we consider priorities, or if we decide that, not to do away with the names, the naming of the departments. So to me, it seems like we still need to have an obligation to kind of go through the sections.
Yeah, I agree with that, Joe. I feel like at a high level, at least, it would just be diligent of us to look through and kind of understand what it is we're either keeping or jettisoning from the charter. All right. So the staff suggested taking out some of the language in 5.13. Any,
The printed mimeograph.
Yeah.
And that part. So it's the copies, it's all available electronically, and they can print out, if somebody shows up and wants it, they can simply print it. Yeah.
Right.
A question, city manager? Are there members of the public or the media or whoever that expect to have copies of these documents?
Not really. Thank you for the question, because we put them all online, so they take the pieces that they want. I don't think, since I've been here, anybody's asked for a printed copy, but we would certainly make it available if someone did want one.
so then this language would just be updated to say it'll be maintained online. If anybody wants it, they can come in and the city will print them a copy.
Correct.
Any comments, concerns about that, or is that something we're all in agreement on? Okay,
But if we're gonna make it where they can come up and request a printed copy, we should have something in the language that they have to make an appointment or request it in, a certain amount of time. They just can't walk into City Hall and demand a printed copy.
What he said. I would agree with putting some language in there. I think that's a great idea of just if someone wants a printed copy, they can make the request to City Hall.
Correct.
Because we certainly fill that.
I mean, somebody might email or call for it and you can
Absolutely.
schedule when they would come in. Okay. All right, 5.14 appropriations. That was, everything in the rest of this chapter, it looks like was recommended by the staff to maintain. And anybody have any comments or thoughts on that one? Are we ready to move on? All right. 5.15 expenditure controls. Everybody seems okay with that? All right, 5.16, transfer of unexpended appropriations.
So I have a question about that. One of having worked in an agency where you use it or lose it, the last month was always spent trying to buy all sorts of stuff with the end of our expenditures. Is there any way that we could roll some of that over to those departments so that they would not have to spend wildly at the end of the year, but could sort of, have that as a, well, I've got an emergency fund of, 4,000, 5,000, whatever dollars that is that they could use the next year for things that they might need.
Thank you, Mr. Heil. I too have worked with those organizations. Where you are
I
spending
got
for
great
your-
stuff, but
Yes, and you have to share that it does not have not experienced that. So it happens years and speaks to that in our budget lines work. And at the end of the year, or even at the end of the quarter.
This section, when you look very closely at it, the key line is that no transfer shall be made of specific fixed appropriations. That's our intent. So there is always something, salary savings or such that are city managers always need to move that around in the fund. But to be very clear, in the general fund, within the capital fund, not move the money between funds without council approval. The rolling over into the next year, we don't roll over, it falls into what's called the fund balance, which is simply the savings in that fund. So as such, the general fund has about $10 million of savings that are just there to back up the general fund spending. So the council always has that ability to put more appropriations in the budget than actually what the revenues are and use out that fund balance. So that is how we would affect that. We had an extra 100,000 this year. We could fall to the fund balance, even though the council could come back in and say, we're increasing the budget by 100,000. That 100,000 just swoops up into that.
okay.
If I can just briefly on this section and the section ahead of it, there is to the point about departments in the budget. There are some provisions that this part of the charter we would want to keep. These two are classic provisions that come up in terms of an adversarial relationship that comes up between a council and manager. There have been city councils and county boards and county councils in the past that have used defunding departments as a way to leverage the power of the manager. And so there are provisions in the charter to prevent that tactic from coming into play in relationship between the manager and the council. Not saying that's going to happen, but it was, in my opinion, wise provision to include, and hence why some of these provisions exist
throughout here. So if departments were to be removed, there are places, this is why we recommended retitling this financial duties or financial management. Is really to keep the controls there if you're going to remove the department structure so that there are some charter controls over certain systems.
And an add-on to what Matthew said about use it or lose it, which I've experienced. A related tendency is if a department doesn't use their whole budget, then they get cut by that amount for the next year. Does that happen?
So we don't necessarily see that happen. Webster Groves operates under a zero-based budget. So while we reflect on the last year's budget when we're adopting the budget, in that process, everything goes back to zero. So the departments rebuild their budget from zero. So there is no expectation, council adding or subtracting, that we're affecting the base, because there is no base. Fiscal year 24, when we start the budget process next month in January, departments will go back to zero, and rebuild up from there. And then, of course, there is a perceived base, but nothing that is technically a base, no departmental right or expectation that they should be at.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful. All right, anything further on 5.16? All right, 5.17, incurring indebtedness. All right, I don't see anybody chomping at the bit to talk about that one. 5.18, specific purposes. And Dr. Peoples, your team did not identify any other areas that they would want to expand the reasons for ponds and stuff. Okay. Thank you.
So we got a thing from Jeannie about point number 2, where we are doing insane asylums, orphan asylums, poorhouses, workhouses. And they had a suggestion for removing that. Some of those outdated notions.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Do you have that language handy? There's a lot of emails.
I have well, never mind, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Just
please.
briefly, I don't know, we obviously do not house prisoners, but we do technically have a jail
Mhm.
here in City Hall. And under law, those are differently defined in City Hall, even though they're in the same building, same walls, it is a jail governed differently. So certainly whatever language you represent, should we ever need to go to bond and use for those specific purposes, to enhance that in any way or such, there is some wisdom in being able to make sure that correction use would still be utilized by the city.
Okay, great. So yeah, so the language that was suggested was for hospitals, industrial schools, mental health and correctional facilities, and other charitable institutions. Would that encompass what you have in mind? How does that sit with you, Matthew?
No.
Okay.
I guess I'd like to ask Neil, or just make sure there's no legal, legacy language here that we need to be aware of, that this corresponds to state or something that could limit our flexibility.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Or if there's some more updated
Yeah.
version. Okay. Anything else on that one? Okay, 5.19. Vote required for issuance of bonds. All right, next one, 5.20, conduct of elections. Seems pretty not confrontational. 5.21, debt statement. Were you gonna say something, Eric? Oh, okay. All right, yeah, on these, I would also look to staff for any additional commentary, which I'm sure you would throw if you had it.
So the only thing about the debt statement existing before here with credit agency. Things were there. Is it necessary to add much more transparency? I don't know that we publish that information every year. But there's no reason to prioritize that change. We're happy to continue doing the debt statement.
All right, thank you. 5.22, finality of bond ordinance and election. All right, 5.23, limit of indebtedness. Okay. 5.24, annual tax requirements. Five point 25, sale of bonds. 5.26, issuance of refunding bonds. 5.27, general provisions. All right, last call this evening for anything under Article 5.
So
Yep.
Jeannie had another thing for Article 5.
I'm glad you're on top of that.
5.3. She wondered about adding a clause to that that said knowingly and willingly approve payment for expenditure.
So 5.3.
Uh-huh.
Anybody have any thoughts about that? I'd be curious to get Neil's interpretation of how that would be. Know what, the various standards of knowingly, willfully. Whatever.
I'll make a note for him.
Okay, thank you. Any further comment from the group? Matthew, do you have an opinion on that?
No, it made sense to me that, if someone screws up, that it is, that's okay. But if somebody's doing it purposely,
Mhm.
then that's not okay. So I like the notion on that.
Okay.
The other question I had about this, in the other places, I've been watching the council meetings and listening to Eric's budget descriptions, and I don't understand much of the way that works, but you are really authoritative and have a great handle on all that. So this is not in reflection to you, but we require professional degrees from people who are in charge of the law and Parks and Recreation. Why not a CPA for finance? So I'm not saying anything about Eric, because what he talks about makes good sense to me. It seems reasonable, but I remember somebody grousing in the Webster Kirkwood Times about the fact that he didn't have one. So I just wondered if that's an important thing. I mean, that would be expensive to have a CPA.
So thank you, Mr. Heil. That was actually the first thought that came to my mind. There's probably a lot better answers than that. But it is costly. I would also say that in terms of municipal finance directors, I don't believe the majority, here or elsewhere, have CPAs. So the common language may be more so, your 4-year degree.
Okay.
That might be the more common language, but not necessarily the accounting.
Okay. That's fine. I just wanted to, because we had that for the others and, I'm not casting any aspersions on what I have heard. Because it's impressed me.
I'd just like to chime in because I am an accountant. I see that requirement in a lot of jobs and it just absolutely isn't necessary in most of them if you have an accounting degree.
Thank you.
We do have other positions, I'll just add this, because, so as the finance director, that's the director, but there's a whole finance. So there are other positions that have specific requirements that are hired in. Role.
Okay, thank you. All right. Article 6, Department of Public Works. The suggestion was to change the masculine language to neutral language where we refer to the director as a he. Which I think, based on our prior conversations, everyone would be in agreement with. Okay. Article 7, Department of Personnel.
Well, isn't the term Department of Personnel, this is not my expertise, but my experience is they call it for example, they call it human resources. Not that maybe it doesn't make a substantive difference, but I wonder if the term is obsolete, Department of Personnel.
Yeah, seems a little more modern. Yeah, it looks like that was one of the comments that staff made also. Or just that it's, we call it the Department of Human Resources even.
Taking notes on other things, but in terms of the Office of Human Resources, we do have a personnel board if we were at that section. We obviously have human resources, but it is not a department.
So was there any sentiment about changing the department, changing the name? Well, I mean, I know they said they wanted to change, suggested maybe changing the name from Department of Personnel to Human Resources.
Yes. But I think there are probably many more appropriate and culturally appropriate where we are in today's time for human resources office. People in culture, all sorts of things. I would like for it not to be as prescriptive so that it can continue to evolve as organizations evolve.
So what is the recommendation then, to leave it as is or move it to Human Resources and count that as broad enough?
I would say go with human resources. I think the technical application of what we call people in terms of title and what their roles are don't have to be so heavily prescribed. The human resources would fit.
Okay. Does the board have any question, comment, objection to that, or is that a recommendation we feel comfortable making?
What we decided last time was we were going to go through the whole thing.
Oh,
make
okay.
Comments and then go back to actually make changes after we had.
Okay.
Is that
Especially
right?
Especially if we're
great.
talking about getting rid of departments.
Yeah, especially if we're getting talking about, yeah, okay,
At least that's what I remember last time us deciding to do, so.
okay, thank you.
And I would add that the term Chief Financial Officer tends to be used rather than Director of Finance.
All this
Mhm. Right, so there was some staff feedback on 7.5. 7.5, the Personnel Board cannot feasibly conduct investigations that are conducted by Human Resources. So just something for us to keep in mind, I guess, as if we're going to keep the language in here, that we'll want to do something to synthesize it with how things can be done.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just clarify, who are the personnel board that's involved here and how are they appointed?
Well, there's 3 personnel board members, and they're appointed by council. And they play a very important role, and just in terms of the investigation, those matters certainly are conducted if needed by human resources. They wouldn't, because the personnel members are 3 citizens at large, if you will, skilled in their trade, certainly. But the investigations that they handle concurrently. So perhaps even just, kind of thinking on the fly, they can certainly refer matters for investigation, but they wouldn't personally.
I wanted to go back where under qualifications, and it says that they need to be, my favorite topic, residents of the community for at least 2 years, which is more stringent than running for council. What's the reason for that? Council or mayor, I might add.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. Maybe we should just make a note of that for, if we're going to pull some of this verbiage out of here, then it's just kind of a note for council when they're reviewing their ordinances.
That's a valid point to have consistency. If there is a residency requirement, it should be the same across the board. Madam Chair, on this back to 7.5 and investigations, are there situations where the personnel board should have that power to investigate on its own? I'm just asking if there would be a situation where that would be the case.
We could certainly ask the city attorney when he returns, but from my experience, there's not. If there's a situation that rises to investigation merit, and I can't go into detail, but for example, it could be turned over to a police department or a neighboring police department. Or you hire outside consultants if there's forensic investigation with accounting or something like that needed. I cannot think of an example where the personnel board themselves would take that on. The other piece, and clearly the charter is almost 60 years old, so older. So things were different. The personnel board today, so they're all working professionals. So I'm not sure how feasible it would be for them to carry that investigation as well. And I don't know what that would have looked like when the charter was originally written. I'll make a note of that though for the city attorney.
All right, thank you. All right, moving through. Any conversation to be had regarding 7.6 classification of employees? Okay, how about 7.7 merit system rules?
Sorry, I'm
Mhm.
going, the attorney, why are they not unclassified? That's okay.
The city attorney?
Yeah, they're listed as classified for. Why are they're, let's see, I have here, so the attorney is not unclassified, so they're classified, are you classified or not?
Class C.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe I'm just a classic. No.
So is that, I don't understand the distinction between classified and unclassified. Is that like hourly versus salary? No? Okay,
It is how you fall into our service, civil service.
okay,
So,
gotcha.
service.
That makes sense.
Again,
Okay.
It's just the word that we're using.
Yep, okay, so that means you're, okay, that makes sense. That I understand.
Thank you.
Add that. Oh,
Yeah.
anything you want, so.
Please.
This is a very old document, so this is one of my, Eric Peterson, personal charter, so please, you're at that. That list is very interesting, because assistant directors, deputy directors of departments are FLSA exempt. They are salaried, non-overtime, leadership level employees, but are classified. Right, and in reality, FLSA has advanced beyond where we wrote these static rules, what was unclassified and is classified. My personal, when we discussed this at staff, my personal thought was, this part needs to come. This is, really an ordinance type power that we could easily understand, but that's up to the council and you all, but there are deputy directors of departments that we consider management leadership that take over departments that are in the classified service subject to the merit system, despite being high level executive. For instance.
When a deputy person fills into the role, do they still remain in the merit system, but they're receiving the pay of the?
That is, so if they're filling in like, if they're acting or such, theoretically, they are an acting department director. But these are folks who every day fulfill an executive function in their jobs, a deputy director or a superintendent or such like that. And so our model here is much smaller, personnel model. The layers, 1954, classified service, unclassified service, fine. So you have not grown executive leadership level that is not well defined in the charter.
Okay.
Madam Chair, would you like the city attorney to address the outstanding questions now or come back to them later?
Oh, yeah, why don't we?
Put them on the spot.
I'm back.
Hello.
So, 5.3. Yes. I have to find the suggested language. All right. The chair had suggested this language, adding the knowingly or willingly. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, so the difference between what the chair suggested is that knowingly or has a specific, what we would call mens rea, as an intent. We have to prove the intent. So what it does is eliminate from the equation mistake. And again, basically what it says, if you made a mistake, you didn't know the intention. Or you may have known the intention to spend the money, which didn't know it was in violation. And that would be. So by adding the mens rea, I think it was a good idea. Frankly, if I were sitting as the city attorney, if someone came to me and said, is this grounds for forfeiture? And it was a mistake. And we clearly had information that it was a mistake. I would say no, it's not. So I think clarifying that would be a good idea.
Okay. Thank you.
Next one, so 7.5, I believe.
Let me have one other thing, note in thinking about this. The only caveat I would provide is what happens if the mistake is happened? What happens if it becomes a matter of an attitude? Is it grounds for forfeiture at that point? That's the question I would pose to you, because there can be a place where gross incompetence, gross ineptitude becomes something that perhaps becomes action. So I only throw that out. So it might require more language. Again, I wasn't there when they wrote it. I wasn't alive when they wrote it. The truth of the matter is, perhaps what they were thinking was to try to accomplish as much as they could. I would tell you that knowingly and willingly would be a good thing to put in there, but it might also be good to address something like gross incompetence, because then you're dealing with what. And you don't have to define it.
Don't we already have the right to fire someone for any reason?
You do.
Okay.
And that's a great point, because it's sort of a redundancy.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one was 7.5, subsection 2. So this is regarding investigation. The personnel board having the authority to do so. Conversation and the suggestion from staff was that the investigation needs to be removed because the personnel would not actually handle the investigation. That's something that goes through resources or refers to the police department, an outside jurisdiction. I wanted your thoughts on that.
So as I read this, it gives them the authority to either independently make an investigation or direct others to engage in the investigation. Although that's not particularly clear, but maybe implied in the language that is here. Okay. And again, it may be, I'm not sure what this phrase means, and this is what's going to be done. Make any investigation which you may consider desirable concerning the administration of personnel in the city service. So is this an investigation of supervisors and how they're administering to the people they work for? Or is this just a general personnel question? I don't know what they mean. You know, if I give it its plain meaning, it sounds to me like it would be an investigation of the way personnel issues are administered in the city. So it gives the personnel board a voice to report to council if they think that there is a problem. They can address it. That's what I think is there. Good idea, bad idea? That's, again, I don't know. I'd like to think about that. Because I think all it really does is it gives them access.
Or was it the plain language as you described it? Then I would not have an objection. The personnel board is appointed by council, so it certainly should be able to make reports to council. That is not how anybody going through this process, and in terms of staff had interpreted it. So I like your interpretation better.
I guess it could also be interpreted as just a opportunity to study an issue and how the city is approaching it versus other jurisdictions. Maybe it could be a more of an academic approach as opposed to, you know, criminal intent or something of that
Yeah,
nature.
I agree with that. I think that's exactly right. I think that's where it's designed to go. I have to tell you, I haven't given this particular, although we went over this with personnel, which is what's there. I haven't seen any convincing intent or interest in doing that. Again, because I think their powers. No, they asked, I mean, they're appointed by council, so they're answerable to council. I think what this basically says is it can give reports, it has a voice. I think it goes hand in hand with number one. And in fact, probably number two probably augments.
So if we change the word investigation to something else, it suddenly takes on a more like a different
Yeah.
right, like make any review, which it may consider desirable or
And
any.
see, I think that would make sense. I mean, I think that word is a little inflammatory. Investigation is, whereas review is far more passive. It goes more the academics suggestion that Joseph made. Yeah, that's something that one could change. That's one of those things I put on the list of maybes, depending on how long the list is. This is something you want to do, because as it sits, it's not offensive. We're looking for clarification rather than a change. But again, it also gives you the ability to interpret. And I would interpret it as review. Again, that's something that you might want to put on.
Can we put like any investigation or review? Can we just add a couple of little words and not have to take it all the way to the election?
I think in the end, it's gonna always, if you're gonna change it that much, it's probably gonna require, but here's another way you can do that, and that would simply be in ordinances that define what it is the person does, you can make that more specific.
Oh, you could define what investigation means.
But the fact that people aren't agreeing on what this means suggests that we probably ought to, if we're going to change it, then we probably ought to
Yeah.
make sure that that we can agree.
I believe that was all.
I think there was one other one, about 5.18 sub 2 about hospitals and sane asylums, et cetera. And Jeannie had some other proposed language.
I'm sorry, which section?
5.18 paragraph 2 on page 20. So the proposed language, oh, you have it on there, yeah.
Is really just to get rid of insane asylums, orphan asylums, poorhouses, jails and workhouses. Let them die and decrease the surplus population. I got that reference.
Except in the city of St. Louis, they still have a workout.
Right.
Yes.
Do you have the proposed, are you pulling that up, Eric?
That's right there, I think. So, it was Matthew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right there.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I can't read that.
It's hard to read. It's in the email Jeannie sent earlier.
You, rather than insane asylums and orphan asylums, you could say treatment centers, industrial schools, and other charity, but again. Charity, institution.
Yeah, her proposed language was for hospitals, industrial schools, mental health and and correctional facilities and other charitable institutions.
Just trying to make sure that it covers everything, and I think it does.
Madam Chair, Neil, to your knowledge, is there any state language that this needs to match up with?
No. No, but I'll look at that. And make sure that it doesn't, but I don't think it does, because although this is the issue, it's so in the name, your language of the statute. Let me put a question mark on that one and make sure it doesn't, Joseph, one way or another. Again, even if it does, I think if you're mirroring the intent of the statute, you'll be fine. I think again, we don't use those words anymore, right? I mean, they're anachronisms, insane asylums, orphan asylums. I mean, that's, are we going to talk about typhoid? And it's like, you could add any number of things to the list, and it's obviously not meant to be an exhaustive list. So I think you could be more generic and general. So even if there were language, and I'll look, but I can't imagine that you have to keep it in order to maintain the powers that you would have. Yeah, and again, look, the last paragraph here is the foregoing enumeration shall not be construed to limit any general provision in this chapter. So again, I think we're covered. We could take those words out as no longer meaningful, not to mention offensive, and take them out.
All right, thank you. All right, so we can get back to Article 7. I think we just finished 7.6. So
Can I
7, oh,
Ask a question about 7.6.
Yeah.
The only, and I think this is probably for you. So the only thing that the unclassified employees have in common is that they're either selected by the council or appointed by the city manager?
Correct. So the theory, this is the merit system that we have in chapter 7 is very similar to the civil services. So there's a classified service that is protected by that merit system, the unclassified service, which is not generally managed, right? And so there are, that is very specific, the directors of departments. So if you stop and think about that, the head of human resources is not a director, it's not a department, they're a manager. And so that's a great example of a person who, although the charter comprehends a department, there's not a department, they are in the classified service, meaning that their discharge, if there are issues regarding employment, is subject to personnel board appeal. It's unclassified services not. The distinction I'm making is the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act exempt and non-exempt is much the same, but that is a much wider definition, a newer definition, understanding of who is management, that exempt status of overtime, not eligible for overtime, salary employee and such, than what these specific provisions give us.
So you mentioned deputy directors specifically. Is your suggestion just adding deputy directors? And then would that mean that now deputy directors and directors are selected by the city manager?
So Eric Peterson's suggestion, very quick,
Sorry.
Eric Peterson's suggestion would be that actually that the distinction between classified and unclassified service be left to personnel. No different than some jobs we create, we don't know if it's going to be exempt or non-exempt. I go through the test, what designed by the Department of Labor to determine if it's going to be exempt or non-exempt. Personnel board, if we're going to keep the merit system, is really that arbiter, that's their job, insulated from the politics to be that decider.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, 7.7 merit system rules. And Jeannie had some input on that, asking if the last sentence aligns with Webster's DEI statement.
Sorry, which last sentence?
I don't know, I'm looking at it.
Is it-
Of subparagraph 1, I
Oh.
think, maybe. Maybe.
It's this line, no question in any test
Yeah.
shall relate to political or religious opinion, affiliations, or service.
So as you consider this, I'll put my attorney hat on, which I don't think you very often, it's not one. But remember, this is the 1950s, when much of these charter provisions were written. There was a different time in terms of application. There was history in municipal government of certain tests for certain positions. Red Scare was going on, your affiliation with any party could theoretically deny you a job. So that line was added there, and I understand the chair's conversation. I think that one, if you're going to look at that, I would really encourage people to have a look at that. We still do test as required for fire and police entry, and there's some state statute requirements that build in there. General employees do not take this classified service. There is no examination required. Essentially, you can determine skills are present without the need of a test.
I'm bothered by the term character. I think that's a vague term, and it's probably and character is obviously important, but it means different things to different people, and I have a feeling it's again kind of an obsolete term in that context.
I wish we had a overwhelming number of applications for all the positions that these tests had to apply for. That's the challenge we have in municipal government now is finding people.
So Eric, do we have I feel like we do, and I just can't remember who it is, a DEI person on our staff?
So we do not have, there is no designated DEI coordinator or such. We certainly have had, and Dr. People sits down, we'll transition back to her, DEI study done. It's Carter Gates. There's no, this time designated staff member. However, I do know that the council is considering the strategic plan to do that work, and maybe furthering that work, and also have provided full money. The mayor or city manager.
And I'm sorry, it's the heart of the discussion and the question.
So, then I'll go first.
Please.
So this, remember, these are not, the merit system rules here are created in the fifties in recognition of moving away from party politics and local
Right.
government, where you had if I was Republican, I'd hire all Republicans. So this is not in the same way, the universal protection of people, you know, when we think about gender identity and things like that, which is part of our DEI statement. But even in some of these other areas, what's in our DEI statement is not covered by Missouri state law. Ours is broader than Missouri state law characterization. So, you know, we'll have to have Neil weigh in, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I was thinking also more broadly, Jeannie's question about whether that part aligns with our DEI, just sort of was looking at the model charter and it talks about in this section, applying an equity lens and recommending that we have a person whose role is dedicated to making sure we're doing that. So I was asking, do we have somebody here who's doing that now?
And I would say the entire issue of DEI with our city government is a work in progress right now.
Yeah, sounds like good.
We only 18 months ago even started to entertain that as an important topic for our community.
Okay, thank you. I just couldn't remember if we had someone. All right. Section 7.8, application register. 7.9, pensions.
I have a question on 7.7. Do we need to, the charter or do we need to explicitly include the dependence on merit and diversity and inclusion as part of that? In 7.7? So we have no mention in 7.7 about diversity and inclusion being important characteristics.
Are you talking about 7.1?
Well, anywhere in the merit system rules, there doesn't seem to be any statement or suggestion that we need to pay attention to those in hiring. And that's something that clearly everyone is doing now. Should some language of that be included in this? Because that's one of the areas that the council was really interested in us focusing on.
And I would just say in response, I think also that's a question for Neil. Because the merit system rules in their initial incarnation, which is, this is my other job, not my mayor job, were really about making sure what you were testing for was job related as opposed to politically related. Maybe this is the place for it. There may be other places for it as well. I just don't know the answer to that. So we'll have to ask him.
This might be one of those things we make a note for.
Yep.
And if we're going to keep it in the charter, then we can talk about it. If
Okay.
not, we can
Yep.
pass that along to the staff.
Chair, members, I can certainly, the city manager, we can send you the merit system rules that do exist. They're chapter 2 of the personnel act. So they're online, anyone can see them. There's only really 12 policies that comprise the merit system.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Okay, 7.10, present employees continued in office. 7.11, rights of employees. 7.12, prohibitions.
Should we add gender and sexual orientation to 7.12? I can't.
So at the end of the first sentence, adding something about gender, orientation, expression,
Mhm.
what have you.
Yep. Yeah, because we've got race, political, religious,
Mhm.
so putting it in there.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I was looking at the right
Yep, yep.
spot in the paragraph. Yeah, I think that's a modernization that would make sense to include here. Any other comments from the group?
I just, one question for 7.12. No appointed salaried officer or employee, that's every employee, whether you're married, okay.
So that the prohibition against giving for candidates across all employees of the city. We part-time. Except members of the council. The elected officials.
And that's just candidates for Webster Groves.
That's correct. So there is no charter or personnel policy provision that prohibits you from donating to friends who are running in cities. Webster Groves, I cannot.
So those are specific to Webster Groves elections.
Yes, for, and very specifically to council and mayor.
Okay.
It does not get into the issue of bond issuances, other policy decisions. Think back to the pension tax that Prop B in 2017, a lot of firefighters and police officers advocating for that. That's because the charter is not prohibited on issue elections. Us as important being involved.
So it talks about, I guess I read that first as the political organization as being separate. So it doesn't say the political organization for council, for a council member. Does that make sense?
I read it that way too, that it's like for any political organization.
Yeah, that's the way I read that.
Again, but so we have never. He is not here, certainly will not speak for the city attorney, but in recent years, we have looked at that as in relation to the offices of council member.
Okay. So we may want to add a comma or something.
And what is,
Or that could be the reason there are no commas in that long sentence.
Maybe, it's good. That's possible too.
are there rules for, it says, take part in a political campaign? Are there rules to the extent, like, does that mean liking something on Facebook, or does that mean putting a yard sign?
Personnel policy. Like, does have a more expansive list on the charter provision as to what that, the yard sign and such.
I'm just curious, are there limits on how much you can donate to other campaigns, or does that vary on whether you can vote for the person or not?
That's a matter of the campaign contributions. Limits that state's.
Okay, thank you. All right, that was a big dense paragraph. Any other comments or thoughts on that one? Okay, then lastly, we have section 7.13 violations. All right.
Can I just ask one question? Does anyone, what is the limit? Like, is there a dollar amount limit of the maximum amount of a fine for a municipal violation? I thought it was $500, but that might have just been the city of St. Louis.
That actually sounds right to me, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
So city attorney.
And actually, I think they just changed that because the dumping, the illegal dumping moved to $1,000. But I'm not sure.
I will make note of it, thank you.
All right, well, that covers all of the sections that we had identified that we would talk about today. So 6:35. One other thing on the review schedule was if time allowed to discuss planning for public engagement strategy and timing. Just looking at the rest of the agenda, looks like it's,
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may, my point on the time schedule to raise this, is just to kind of resurface that amongst the group, that we need to be thinking about at what point to do some kind of public engagement, one or more tactics. My own personal view is I think we need to wait until we kind of have a set of maybe proposals or at least some options to put forward to people to react to. I think we're still in this kind of stage. It's really too vague but perhaps at some point in January, February, we need to kind of reach a decision about how to go forward on that.
yeah, I would agree with that. It feels a little premature. Get a little further, get our training on boards versus at large and stuff like that. Figure out what we might want to get input on.
Yep.
Okay. All right, agenda item 8, consider agenda items for the next meeting. Any particular items anybody wants to make sure get included? All right, item 9, we'll just review the public policy visiting lecturer dates on January 9th. We have our presentation on DEI from a policy lens, and on January 23rd, wards versus at-large elections and term limits. Next item is future meeting dates. Those are both of our January dates. Tammy, I know you had a comment you wanted to share about future meeting dates after that.
Well, I wanted to bring it up for discussion because we've set meeting dates that are a lot more frequent than what we all had initially thought this was going to be. And to see if there's a point where we feel like we don't need to have them as frequently. Because for me, the frequency of it and, the homework and the reviewing of emails and things like that is so frequent now that I feel like I can't do 2 jobs well. My job outside of here and then the job of being on the board for a long period of time. So, certainly January is really important. We've waited really a while to get these people in to come and talk to us professionally. But going all the way through July with biweekly meetings would be too much for me. And I didn't know how it was working with everyone else's schedule. This isn't what we initially thought it was going to be.
I would agree. It was rather daunting to
agree.
look that far out.
I also kind of concur. But I thought we were going to wean.
Yeah,
back.
is there a point where we
Yeah.
kind of slow down on that a little bit?
And my preference was to do it as intensively as possible and get it done quicker. Because I think the longer you wait between meetings, the more loss you have of collective memory of what we've been working on. And it certainly met my expectations of what I committed to.
Yeah, my recollection is that we had agreed to, for 2 or 3 months up front, just to
Right.
get a sense of ourselves as a group and start doing a deep dive into some of the nitty gritty of stuff. And then we would taper off to once a month. But I guess the question is, when do we feel like we'll
So,
hit that once a month
so
start?
I suppose the question is, are we open to going to more of a monthly schedule after January 23rd's meeting?
I personally think it's a little early to make that decision, but I'm open to anybody's
Mhm.
opinion on that. I think we should probably reevaluate that in January and see how far we are. But to make a decision right here in December, I think it might be a little premature.
Right, we don't have to
Oh.
decide a schedule right now. But it was a question to people how this is working with their outside lives, and if they feel like they're able to devote the quality time to this that we all really want to be able to.
Mhm.
I would say that I agree that January is too early to make that decision, but having this conversation now, maybe we should consider that we're spending too much time on certain things. Because we did say that we would taper off to only once a month at some point. And again, looking at that schedule through September of biweekly, it is rather overwhelming. Just my 2 cents.
Well, especially once we throw in some town halls or other public engagement, that's, that could end up being quite a lot in any given month.
Yeah, see, I have the advantage of being retired, so so I'm not working. But I guess I worry about what we're doing now is really simple and fast. It's really, identifying places where we want to come back and look. And I think that actually it will take more work to go back and look and come up with language and that. Now, that could be done by subgroups outside of a regular meeting. So I'm not adverse to that, but I think that what we're doing now is really fast and easy, and that it will get more difficult as we go forward.
Depending on whether or not we keep departments.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. But some of these other topics are going to require quite a lot of discussion, I think, and sort of prioritizing which will, for the council, like these are these are the 10 things we think.
So when
go
do we
before the
have
committee.
we were trying to talk about this before based on like elections and things like that and prudent things. Do we have a goal of when we're trying to send this to council?
Yeah, Madam Chair, yes, that schedule that Jeannie sent around earlier this afternoon has a proposed timeline that if you look through all the pages, you'll see at the end that there is, the timing of when to submit, which I think is September. But that, and that's our deadline. So we have to finish our overall review, then start going through in sections or however we decide as a group to approach markup process. And whether that's as a total group or as Matthew suggested, maybe it's a subgroup. So maybe we go into some kind of subgroup approach. Again, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying as far as time involved. But to Nicole's point, I think we're starting to get into the, in January, February, we'll be moving into the harder stuff. If actually, what are the set of changes that we want to make?
Mhm. Well, and it's not twice a month or once a month, right? Like other ways to shift that thinking might be, well, maybe we don't want, maybe every 3 weeks or something like that. Or we kind of bite the bullet and commit to longer meetings. So even though we only meet once a month, maybe we meet
Yeah,
for
and-
3
and I-
hours
Well,
and have a
lately
steeper
we,
agenda.
I mean, have the meetings, like we went through all of this by 6:35.
Yeah.
So if the meetings were just half an hour longer, but once a month, would we get more into the topic and it be fresh? And, so there's a lot of different options to consider. From the city's perspective, when, in order to make it to the April ballot, when do you need to have the council to begin considerations?
Madam Mayor, how quickly can the council?
So the schedule is laid out, has your final report due to us in November. I think that gives you October on the schedule to really finalize what that is. That would mean then that we would have essentially two meetings in November, 2 in December, and 1 in January to take our votes on what you all have recommended. And I'll be honest, one of the things that we'll have to decide as a council is, do we want to do another round of public input before we take those votes, which then would make the time period longer. So I would say that 6 weeks or 6 meeting time in there gives us room to do public input if we wanted to. You know, you may hate me for this thought that I just had, though, also is if there are a couple of things that you all know are absolute priorities, you can send them to us when you're finished. There's nothing that says you have to hold everything and do it in one single report to us. So if you've gone through the entire document and you agree these are the 4 most important pieces for us to look at, I think you can send them to us and then work on the other stuff and see where you are relative to the deadline. And again, you know, council's preference is to send some of the stuff to the April 24 ballot. It is not an absolute requirement. As Neil said, there are financial implications, but there's nothing that says it has to be that election.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank
And
you.
one other point on this, on the agenda, the future meeting dates, I think the idea of the doodle poll was to identify if we were to have meetings, you know, on these dates, do we have a quorum available to meet at this point? Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to meet every 2 weeks.
True.
Additionally, on that doodle poll, I didn't receive a copy. And maybe that's why there's 2 people missing.
You didn't receive the doodle?
Mm-mm.
Do you receive my other emails?
Mhm.
Thank you. I will look at it. I used everybody's current age, but I will look at that. I certainly want you to get the doodle polls. On that note, of course, we have the 2 January meetings that are confirmed. So of the 10 responses that I did receive, you'll see how many folks are available there. I didn't even bother to put the dates after July because it really tapered off, which is understandable. Schedules are hard to go that far out. But there are some dates as well, some holidays that we'll need to decide alternative dates should the members so choose. The other piece, and Ms. Finney is not here this evening, but Mondays are very difficult for her, and I believe she was going to bring it up as well. And I think at some point in time, along with meetings tapering off, this group is also going to decide if there are other dates and times that were better.
Right.
So should you all want to discuss that, I wanted to throw that out there as well. But February 6th, if possible, I would at least like to set the next couple of February's meeting dates so we can get those posted for the public. February 6th, there's 9 available.
It's really 10 because I did not do the
Okay.
poll.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So there'd be 10 available, and of course, February 20th is President's Day, so we wouldn't have that meeting.
Now we could just take that off the schedule so there'd be only one that one. So
Yeah.
At least to start.
Work. Fine by me to take it off.
Yeah, but I think as I recall in talking with Jennifer, at some point in January, early February, you need to revisit the date that we meet and see if we can come up with something that works for her.
But for her,
But-
wasn't that only for the first half of the semester?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
there
mean,
was some
not that we
caveat.
can't do it, but I mean, it's
Yeah.
not, if most of us do prefer Mondays, then we can go back to Monday when
Yeah.
your conflict ends. Okay,
Okay, so February 6th is locked in, and we'll revisit dates after that at another.
okay. And do we want to talk about having that be a longer meeting so we can cover more? You know, the meeting is more efficient if we're not having to do, the month is more efficient if we're not having to do 2 sets of administrative conversation either.
I think if we make it longer, it might, would we want like a 10-minute break or something? You know, what I
Yeah, of
mean,
course.
to-
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just throwing it out there.
Sure.
As long as it doesn't get longer than 3 hours, I.
Oh, my goodness, no. Yeah,
As long as it's over by 10, I'm good.
all right.
I'm okay going longer.
Is there, yes,
5 to-
and there's the,
so 5 to
but
8,
there's
you can
other
bring a
people that are
sandwich.
having to be here too, so. Does that, are there things we should consider as far as length of meetings in for city staff?
You know, as long as we're not going into Monday night football.
We're the unclassified staff, so.
Did they not go too late, but it either. We haven't hit March Madness yet.
Okay. All right, well, I think that's item number 10. We can take a
One,
more
just
to-
one point. I mean, we talked, Nicole, and with Jeannie and kind of work through agenda. I'm happy to kind of recut the timeline a little bit if we starting with that January meeting, go to a longer time frame and see how many other topics we think we can cut if we want to try that.
Oh, that's true. You know what? You're right. I was thinking for February, but there's no reason.
Well,
can't
yeah,
do
I
that
mean,
in
we could start it in January.
Yeah, no, I agree.
If,
Yeah.
again, scheduling everybody else.
I have a standing meeting at 7:30 on Monday night, so a longer meeting would get in the way of that.
Could we start earlier?
What?
Could we start earlier? Than 5?
From my perspective, we could start as early as you want. I'm retired. It's easy for me.
Yeah, I think 5 was about as.
You,
much
Every-
as
before say that 5 o'clock. was-
Every other Monday for me, I'm available. It just so happens this schedule works for me, but I don't know. Earlier is fine, right now.
Let's check with Mel. I think she might have had she's got younger kids. Okay, but yeah, we can definitely make sure that maybe we could talk about that a little bit, and email what people's timing is. But yeah, if we could knock out a few things in January, have a long February meeting, maybe we'll be on track. Okay, thank you. All right, agenda item 11, any member discussion or questions that we haven't already covered? All right, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I
Any opposed? Meeting is adjourned.